I have a PowerPoint, and I have to share with you that this morning the computer didn't work, and so people didn't get the PowerPoint. And the one I have, we figured out that I had sent her a partial one a few days ago. It wasn't totally finished, but there's enough of it that the main themes will be on the PowerPoint, and then Iris is going to email to you the full PowerPoint that I hope to have here. So, and I'll be explaining some of what else I was going to include on it. Anyway, please raise your hand or interrupt me. Once I get talking, I just go with the flow, and it can be hard to think, can I interrupt her? Definitely, please do, because your questions are the ones that are important in terms of why you're here. Why I used to be at Sonoma State, and I recommend it highly if you're looking for a four-year college after this. Very good school, even though I worked there. So I actually have a different title than this says, Subversive Adventurer, but it kind of fits in terms of what I'm going to be talking about. And so, here we go. So I'm going to be discussing mainly two themes, the New Woman and the Arts and Crafts movement. And these are very important for understanding Bay Area history, for appreciating Jack and Charmian. They were both influenced by these movements. But the movements were really hot in the Bay Area in the 1890s, 1900s, when Jack and Charmian were forming their adult identities and thinking about what to do with their lives. This photograph you can see is, it was posed. It was taken by a very well-known woman photographer at the time, and I forget her name and I can't read it. But if you find a clear reproduction of it, you'll be able to learn about her. And I think it's such a good example of their lives, that first and foremost, they were curious about the world, and they were curious about anything that they would encounter. And I think Charmian was actually more curious, because she was writing and learning about things for herself, where Jack was looking for ideas for stories, right? He wanted to turn what he had into a commodity, something he could publish and make money off of. So, let's, I'm not used to it like this. Excuse me. If you want to talk about the period that they were living, it was a cusp of major change in American society. A lot of people are still living in the Victorian style, and historians who talk about life then refer to what they call the cult of domesticity. And you can see from these pictures, here you have the father, the paterfamilias, if we want to use a fancy word. And his wife is much lower in the screen, so she's less important than he is. And he's in charge of the family, and she's like off to the side, and she's in charge of the home and the household. And I put a word up here, homosociality, not sexuality, but sociality. And a key way that people lived their lives back then was separate genders. So men and women really had very separate lives. Men, for the most part, would be off to work or on the farm or at the factory or be clerking in an office, an insurance office, and the women were to be home. Women were not to have any opinions of politics or economy. So what they could even express in conversation was limited. Well, as you might guess, after the Civil War, where suddenly people are concerned about rights, human rights, and what's happening in the society, and the word freedom is starting to resonate in people's minds, there are women who are going to start thinking about changing society. We're not talking about a lot of women, but we've got women forming temperance movements. Let's get alcohol out of the scene, right? We just heard, if any of you heard, there was just a lot of talk about alcohol during the Senate hearing. Women wanted men out of bars because what would happen is after work, he'd come home, he'd have dinner, and then he'd go off. If he was middle class, he'd go to a men's club or he'd go to a lodge like the Elks or the Moose. Those all formed then, and she would stay home and just knit or whatever she did. Well, some women realized in time, as their children are growing up, they have a little more free time. Well, what do you do with your free time? They find ways to form new organizations, or they start asserting themselves. If you look in the history of San Francisco, many of the important institutions were formed by women at this time. Orphanages, schools, art schools, museums. You find this happening quite a bit at this time for this particular group of women. And again, they're not they're not the average woman. They're a particular class. They're this new woman. Well, if you live in the new woman, here's a photograph from the time. Somebody satirizing the new woman. Here's, the poor drudge at home, right? The wife who's stuck at home having to do the wash. Remember, they didn't have automatic machines back then. Everything had to be done by hand. They had really big, monstrous vacuum cleaners, but women, even my mother, would put things out on the line and beat them rather than use some of the equipment that was available. So it was heavy labor for women. And here we have the new woman, and she's dressed, oh my God, she's in pants. And she looks like she's, superior to the poor woman at home, who's doing very important work, but nobody's really recognizing it very much, including a lot of times the new woman. Just like during, when women's rights start percolating and getting active, there's always this issue of more upper class women not honoring the working class women and their lives having different needs and different desires. And that kind of shows in this picture. So the new woman is physically active. She starts playing tennis. She goes to the golf course. She rides bikes. She just does all kinds of activities. And women are not supposed to be doing anything physically active. They have been prevented from doing such all through the 1800s because their organs might shrink. They might turn into he-women. They're going to be perverted in some way if they are too physically active. So that's a problem. In the 1890s, the bicycle was a big fad. And women in the Bay Area really took to the bicycle. Remember that back then they didn't have gears. They were like big, clunky. It took a lot of effort to do those bicycles, and yet it was nothing for them to go 40, 50 miles for a day, for a picnic. Do you ever look at history and say, how could have done that, Were they different people then? Were they a different species? I think that's one of the fun things about history is looking back and remember that their whole education and training has been different from what you've had. So of course they're going to have more capabilities in some areas, but if you gave them an iPad, they wouldn't know what to do. So it all evens out in the end. Dress reform, and that shows up here. Advanced education. During this time, the average American had no more than a 6th grade education. If he was better educated, and I say he because more men were getting schooling, we still don't have fully universal education. He might go to 8th grade He might have some high school, but high school was very rare back then. So for a woman to go to college was really off the charts. And so the new woman, again, you can see she's going to get skills and knowledge and confidence that most women don't have, because she'll have high school or even college education. She's going to have modern ideas, and I'll be looking at some of those. Of course, she's going to support voting for women. And sexuality, she's going to be questioning the mores and the norms about women's sexuality. Can women have sex? Can they enjoy sex? What about birth control? It's not allowed at this time. Very common at this period in terms of sexuality is don't fool with yourself. Everything was like masturbation was the big boo-boo with us, you know. This is what people worried about. Young men in particular were constantly being told, you know, don't abuse yourself or you'll lose all your power. And there were a lot of myths then that still exist today on some levels. So it's really fun to read about sexuality during this period and see the cartoons and the books that were put out, the advice books for boys and for girls. They're so different from today, where you've got little nude figures with real bodies. You know, that didn't happen back then. So, any questions? Okay. So these women are going to have individuality and nonconformity. And of course, I'm putting Charmian in the role of a new woman. This is Mills College back at the time when she would have gone there. She had a 2-year course, which was really pretty good because not that many women went for a whole 4-year course back then. When Mrs. Stanford's husband wanted to set up the university in Palo Alto, she said, I want it to be 50% women, and he wouldn't go along with her. He allowed that maybe a quarter of the student body could be women. So you see how strong the idea was that women shouldn't be educated. So Mills Seminary, which is what it was called back then, was really groundbreaking in a lot of ways. It and a small number of other schools around the country were just for women. I went to an all-women's college. It was, you know, and it ended after I left 2 or 3 years later, it became co-ed. And most women's colleges today that were there when I was a college student are now co-ed. Here's Charmian on her horse, and she's doing 2 things that are upsetting people. 3 things. She's riding alone. She doesn't have a chaperone. She should have some kind of man or some elderly woman riding with her to make sure that, you know, her whatever is not affected, or that her purity is maintained. Okay. She's got a skirt that she designed to split in the middle. She at this point started thinking about designing her own clothes for particular purposes. But she'd be running in the hills around Berkeley, and people would yell at her and curse her, you know, and call out all kinds of names because they thought she was a terrible example for other young women at the time. The other thing is she's riding cross saddle at a time when women were riding side saddle. I don't know, are there any horse riders here who have done side saddle? If you look at them, if you ever, you know, some of the British programs that go back in the past, you'll see the women ride side saddle. It all had to do with an earlier British queen had a hip problem, and she couldn't ride cross saddle. And from that point, they designed these side saddles. It's really a lot harder to manage, you know, a wild, crazy, wonderful horse from that position. Your body is all twisted like this. But I think also there is sort of this idea that women's legs are open, so there's this implicit sexual fear underlying the idea of women cross-saddle, right? Just like mansplaining, you know? We didn't have that word in my day, back in the old ages. So, naturally, there would be a lot of criticism of these women there, and what you have is, I love this little cartoon, this bike rider, she's entering heaven and she says, "Isn't heaven in there?" And he says, "True, but this is the ladies' entrance, and she's not a lady, so she's not going to go to heaven." And then the other way that they're often criticized, here you see a cigarette, of course, new women also smoke cigarettes. And when you read novels from this period, of any character, any woman character lights up, you know, she's a bad girl. So that's a signifier. But this is, they would call them blue stockings. I'm not sure where that came from. But, you know, here she is, she's certainly not very feminine, and she's just overloaded with her study, her books. Very bad. Then we have, they would be suffragists. This cartoon shows, "Vote for the man-hater." It's critical of women who want the vote. And here's a woman, like, you know, going to the guy holding the baby, "You better treat her right, you know. I'm in charge. I'm going to rule all the men." Here we have an important quote from Victoria Woodhull. Has anybody heard about her? Ah, okay. Victoria Woodhull was the first woman to run for president in the United States. If you want a fun biography sometime, look up a book on Victoria Woodhull. She and her sister were these very interesting women. They would have seances, and they convinced the leading capitalists of the time, like John D. Rockefeller, that they knew more about the stock market than they did. And they became very popular, these two, and rich too, I might say, because they were able to con some of the most powerful men in the country. But one of the most memorable things about Victoria Woodhull is she taught the idea of free love. "I am a free lover. I have an inalienable, constitutional," that's interesting, "and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long or short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please." Well, that would upset a lot of people even today, frankly. You know, they would have some serious discussions about that. And yet, it did become popular among what we call the pre-hippie set. So, for example, Jack London's mother belonged to a group of people in San Francisco who believed in rights for what was called Negroes back then, for rights for working people, and for free love. And so you find little gatherings of people in the Bay Area here and there who will admit it. And Charmian's own aunt and uncle that she was living with through her, mainly her teenage years, believed in this concept and taught it to her. And she's very interesting. She's one of the few women I've ever studied who was totally free sexually. She believed that sex was important for creative juices, that it was a wonderful gift, and so it shouldn't be attached to any ideas about who with, or what they look like, or whether they're married or not. And she, during this time in the 1890s, when she was living in Berkeley and going out to dances at the university and, you know, looking like a very normal young woman, at those events, behind the scenes, she was having a love affair with a married man in San Francisco. So here she is, off, not allowing anybody to get in her way. Even then, she was really good at knowing how to behave in public, certain kinds of public, proper bourgeois events, and be praised. People said she had a great personality, she was a good conversationalist. Actually, she was somebody who would really be happier alone and was a very private person. So she's always separating out her private self from what she's showing the world. And that occurs even in the snark. I came across an example the other day. In her diary about the snark, she says, Nakata kept begging us to bleach his hair. Nakata is the young Japanese man that comes on the boat in Hawaii. But in the book, she says, I had the idea, it seems as though she is forcing him because given the racial relationships at the time, she has to be in charge. So it's very interesting, these little reversals that you can find between what's in her diaries, in her private letters, and what's in the book. Remember, any book has always got a certain sense of composition, and the writer is shaping it for different reasons. And Charmian is writing to a fairly racist audience. And yet she manages to be dancing around all the time, where she says in one paragraph, she has these like kind of stereotypical descriptions, and then in another paragraph, she talks about how great the people are, how she really finds them fascinating and smart. So you just see this balancing act going on all the time with her. So Free Love. Victoria Woodhull. Now the other movement is the arts and crafts movement, and this was an art movement at the time that really took over the Bay Area, along with like a part of Upper New York. It seems like parts of the country where you had very liberal Christianity, like you did in the East Bay at the time. You had an attraction to socialism and to movements like the arts and crafts movement. Now, socialism at this time is not a terrible word like it's used today. You'll see letters to the editor where someone says, oh, so-and-so's just a socialist, don't vote for them. Well, you have to remember we came through the Cold War, anti-communism, and so there's this sense of it's an ugly word. Well, back then the Socialist Party actually had people in office. People ran for the presidency on the socialist ticket. There were a number of major cities that had socialist mayors and city council people. So it was a very different set of thoughts back then. A lot of it was focused on, let's get sewers, let's get children out of the mines, a lot of very practical things to help life be better for people. Now the arts and crafts movement, these were a group of artists in England. The key one was William Morris, and they associated with socialists. And they thought one way to help men, because it's primarily men they're concerned about, who are working in factories, is to give them a different way of life. And that is, let's go back to the old crafts. Let's bring back what's been forgotten about good old England, So what can we do? And they developed this idea that instead of having a Victorian cluttered house, you wanted very simple beauty in things around you. And you'll see this, I understand you're going to the park, some of you, and you'll notice very quickly the difference. The Victorian style was very cluttered and dark, dank, kept the outside world out, very hard to keep clean. it worked because, of course, people then who lived that way also had maids who were badly treated. Here's a quote from the period by John Ruskin, another leader of the movement, that today the world was divided into segments of men, and all the little piece of intelligence that is left in a man is not enough to make a pin or the head of a nail. I love this. It's got a misspelling, but I kept it anyway. Have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. So this whole idea in California, where it really blossomed in the Bay Area and also in Pasadena, was that you lived a good life if you adapted the ideals of the arts and crafts movement. And one of the main features was to bring nature into the house, not close it out. And so you have a very particular style of housing, and if you go to Berkeley, you'll see it all over. The idea of arts and crafts is still very popular today. There are people who like arts and crafts homes. You can go to new developments and walk around and say, oh, that's really arts and crafts, the way that's built. It's, you know, there's something about it. It takes into account things like these pillars. It uses stonework. In the house, the houses would bring in nature in the sense of the woodwork, the light. There weren't curtains over the windows. The furniture is very simple, unadorned, undecorated. And so you'll find there are, it's definitely still a style that people subscribe to. The difference is that back then, if you liked arts and crafts, you also sort of saw yourself as a superior person because you were choosing to make your life a certain way so that you'd have time, more free time. If you have a house that's designed in a very simple way to be practical, then women don't have to work as hard. They're going to have more free time. If you ever go to the Oakland Museum, they have one of the best displays of California history anywhere in the state. And they have a really good section on this period of time. In California, you see the poppy. It becomes a very common symbol because that's what we have. Arts and crafts people developed new kinds of lamps. Pottery was popular. The furniture would have leather on it. And along with that, they would use native arts. They would get local native baskets to decorate because those fit in the idea of craftsmanship, that an individual person made something of beauty that was also useful. So the whole idea is, let's make labor easier, particularly for women, and we'll have a simpler way of life. We're going to go up in the hills and pick poppies and dance. And you actually read about things like that with Jack London and the people he ran around with. And it's a movement that advanced women, especially in the Bay Area. There were women who started their own workshops for building furniture or pottery, for doing special kinds of embroidery. Women had a lot to do with spreading the movement. Julia Morgan is a very famous arts and crafts architect, and she comes out of Berkeley at this time. And in the process, women also became important technological innovators. So if they were doing pottery, they would find new glazes, they would find new ways of doing throwing pots. So here's this sort of ideal that, okay, you know, I'm an arts and crafts lady. I can just read at my leisure now, or I can make pottery, or I can go hiking or bicycling or whatever it is. And of course it was unrealistic.